The old house stood at the edge of a forgotten village, its crumbling walls bearing the weight of countless winters. Time had eroded its once proud facade, leaving behind nothing but faded memories. Inside, dust blanketed every surface and cobwebs hung like veils in the dimly lit rooms. It was in this decaying relic that Daniel Grayson, a historian and freelance investigator, found himself standing. His task was straightforward, or so he thought. He had been hired to catalog and preserve historical artifacts after the passing of the house's last occupant, an elderly recluse named William Hargrave. As he ascended the creaking staircase to the attic, a peculiar sense of unease crept over him. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself resented his presence. His flashlight cut through the dusty gloom, illuminating a maze of forgotten relics. Old trunks, tarnished photo frames, and piles of yellowed newspapers. Amidst the clutter, something caught his eye, a battered wooden chest shoved into a dark corner, its metal clasps rusted but still intact. With a grunt, Daniel dragged the chest into the faint light streaming from the attic's single cracked window. His fingers trembled with a mixture of excitement and foreboding as he forced the clasps open. The lid creaked, revealing an assortment of aged documents, leather-bound journals, and, most curiously, a bundle of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon. They were old, far older than anything else in the chest. The paper was fragile, stained with age, and marked by the unmistakable sprawl of handwritten ink. On the front of the first envelope, written in shaky but deliberate handwriting, were the words, "To my family back home, if I do not return." Daniel's breath hitched. His mind raced with possibilities. Letters from the past were not uncommon in his line of work, but there was something deeply personal, almost haunted, about this one. He carefully untied the ribbon and extracted the first letter, unfolding it with care. The ink had faded but was still legible, the words telling a story that time itself had tried to bury. Letter 1, June 12, 1944. My dearest Margaret and little James, I write to you from a place I can hardly describe, though I will try my best. We arrived in France 2 weeks ago after crossing the Channel. War has turned this land into a scarred, desolate expanse. Fields burned to ash, villages reduced to hollow shells. But it is not just the destruction that weighs on me, it is something else, something far worse. Our platoon has been stationed in a remote village called Saint Renaud, deep in the forested hills. It is not on any official map as far as I know, though its people still linger here, their faces hollow and haunted. They watch us with wary, knowing eyes, as if silently urging us to leave before it's too late. The first night we set up camp near the village church, an ancient, crumbling structure that looks like it has stood for centuries. As darkness fell, an uneasy silence blanketed the area, broken only by the distant howling of the wind through the shattered windows of the church. We tried to rest, but none of us could sleep, not truly. Then, the footsteps began. At first, we thought it was the wind stirring the fallen leaves, but it became unmistakable, measured, deliberate steps echoing from the woods beyond our camp. Private Simmons was the first to investigate, convinced it was just a stray villager or perhaps a lost animal. He returned pale-faced and trembling, insisting he saw nothing, but we all knew something had frightened him. The following nights were worse. The footsteps came closer, circling the camp. Some of the men claimed to hear whispers carried on the wind, though no one could make out the words. A few swore they saw figures, shadowy shapes lurking just beyond the firelight, vanishing the moment anyone tried to get a closer look. I know how this must sound. Perhaps it is only our minds playing tricks on us, worn thin by exhaustion and fear. But last night I saw it. I was on watch duty near the perimeter, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkened tree line. For hours there was nothing but stillness. Then, just past the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure, tall, thin, draped in what looked like an old military coat. At first, I thought it was one of our own men. I called out, but it did not respond. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. As I drew closer, the figure turned slowly, and I swear, Margaret, its face was obscured, not by shadow but by something far worse. Its features twisted and flickered, like a corrupted film reel, never settling into anything human. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle, but when I looked again, it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. I'm not sure how much longer we can hold out here. The men are on edge, nerves frayed to the breaking point. Whatever this is, it is watching us, waiting. I feel it even now, its eyes piercing through the darkness. If I do not return, please remember that I loved you both with all my heart. I fear that something far worse than war has found us here. Forever yours, Thomas. Daniel lowered the letter, his fingers trembling. The ink was faded, but the dread woven into the words felt as vivid as if they had just been written. He could almost hear the distant echoes of those measured, deliberate footsteps creeping through the dark. He carefully placed the letter back into its fragile envelope, feeling a cold sweat trickle down his spine. He could no longer dismiss the strange atmosphere of the house as mere imagination. Something dark clung to these letters, a piece of history that refused to rest, and there were more letters waiting to be read. The following evening, Daniel Grayson sat alone in the dimly lit study of the abandoned house, the first letter still weighing heavily on his mind. Outside, a bitter wind howled, rattling the old window frames like restless spirits demanding entry. Despite the cold seeping through the ancient walls, sweat beaded on his brow. He could still hear Thomas Fisher's desperate words echoing in his mind, those chilling descriptions of whispers in the wind and flickering, distorted faces. With a deep breath, he reached for the second envelope from the weathered bundle. Its edges were brittle and dark stains marred the paper, ink or perhaps something far more sinister. The envelope's seal had long since crumbled, allowing the contents to slip free with an almost reluctant grace. Daniel unfolded the letter carefully, his heart pounding as though it already anticipated the horrors within. Letter to June 18, 1944. My dearest Margaret and little James, it has been 6 days since I last wrote, though it feels like an eternity. Time moves strangely here, as though trapped in an endless twilight. We are still stationed near the village of St. Renaud, though the men whisper of leaving, even if it means desertion. They are right to be afraid. Something is wrong here, something that defies reason. The villagers have all but vanished. At first, they would linger near the edges of our camp, watching silently with hollow, sunken eyes. But now they are gone. No warnings, no signs of departure. Just empty houses and streets swallowed by creeping fog. It is as if the forest itself devoured them in the night. Yesterday, Captain Harlow ordered a search party into the surrounding woods after Private Simmons went missing during his night patrol. His absence was only discovered at dawn, though we heard no struggle, no shouts, only the wind whispering through the twisted branches like mocking laughter. I volunteered to lead the search, taking Corporal Davies and 3 others. We moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, though none of us truly believed bullets would offer any protection from whatever this is. The deeper we went into the woods, the more the air thickened, heavy with the stench of decay. There were no signs of Simmons, only broken branches and strange, twisted symbols carved into the trees. The markings were crude yet deliberate, like ancient runes etched by an unseen hand. As we pressed on, the forest grew darker, despite it being midday. The canopy above seemed to close in, strangling the weak sunlight until we were left in near total darkness. Then we found the chapel. It was ancient, far older than anything built by mortal hands. Blackened stone walls rose like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, covered in twisted vines that seemed almost alive. A rusted iron gate stood half open, inviting, or perhaps daring, us to enter. Against my better judgment, we did. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the scent of burnt incense and old blood. The floor was littered with shattered pews and torn pages from forgotten scriptures. At the far end stood a crude stone altar, stained dark with what could only be dried blood. Above it, etched into the back wall, was a symbol unlike any I've ever seen. A jagged, spiraling sigil that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, even in the dim light. Private Langston collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as if in agony. "They're watching us," he whispered. "They've always been watching." We barely had time to react before the chanting began, low, guttural voices rising from the shadows. The language was alien, harsh and grating, like claws scraping across stone. It echoed through the cavernous hall, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. In the flickering light of our trembling flashlights, shapes began to move, figures half hidden by the dark, their outlines distorted and wrong. They circled the room slowly, deliberately, like predators toying with their prey. I ordered a retreat, though in truth I barely held myself together. We stumbled back through the woods, never daring to look behind us. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting to trap us within its nightmarish embrace. It was only by some cruel twist of fate that we emerged back at camp, gasping and wild-eyed like hunted animals. Captain Harlow demanded an explanation, but what could we say? That we had seen faces that were not faces? That we had heard voices speaking in tongues older than time itself? Simmons is still missing. So are Langston and Corporal Davies now. They vanished during the night, leaving behind only the sound of footsteps receding into the dark, and the faint echo of whispered names. Margaret, I fear we are not meant to leave this place. Something ancient and hungry watches from the shadows, growing bolder with each passing night. We are trapped, not just in this cursed forest, but in something far worse, something beyond human comprehension. If I can find a way to send these letters, perhaps someone will know the truth. Perhaps someone will remember us. Pray for me, for all of us. Yours forever, Thomas. Daniel finished the letter with trembling hands, struggling to steady his breath. His mind reeled, torn between skepticism and a growing, gnawing belief that this was no mere wartime paranoia. The way Thomas described the forest, the ancient chapel, and the twisted symbols felt too vivid, too visceral to be dismissed as fiction. A sudden creak echoed from deep within the house, startling him. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, stretching toward him like grasping fingers. He forced himself to breathe, reminding himself that the house was old, prone to settling and groaning in the wind. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was listening. And outside, carried on the cold night air, came the faintest sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing closer. The house groaned again, its ancient beams protesting against the biting wind that howled outside. Daniel sat frozen in the dimly lit study, his hands trembling from the weight of the second letter. He could still hear the eerie chanting described by Thomas Fisher echoing in his mind, mixed with the imagined sound of approaching footsteps. Was it the wind playing tricks on him, or was something far worse at play? He forced himself to focus. There were still 3 letters left, each a link in a chain dragging him deeper into a forgotten nightmare. His fingers brushed over the next envelope, its edges brittle and darkened as though scorched by unseen flames. The seal was long broken, leaving the letter's contents exposed like a festering wound. With a deep breath, He unfolded the aged parchment and began to read. Letter 3, June 23, 1944. Margaret, my beloved, I do not know if these words will ever reach you, but writing them is the only thing keeping me tethered to whatever remains of my sanity. The walls between this world and something else are thinning, and I fear it may already be too late for me. 2 more men vanished last night, Private Harris and Lieutenant Beckett. No signs of a struggle, no trail to follow, just empty bunks and that same damned whispering echoing through the trees. The men no longer speak of rescue or reinforcements. We know no one is coming. We are alone here, abandoned to whatever nightmare has claimed this cursed place. The fog is thicker now, curling through the camp like living tendrils, cold and suffocating. It obscures everything, swallowing the world beyond the fire's weak glow. I can feel it pressing against my skin, icy and invasive, like unseen fingers searching for purchase. Last night, I dreamt of the chapel again. The dark altar, the blood-stained stone, and that grotesque symbol carved into the wall. But this time I was not alone. A figure stood before the altar, clad in tattered military fatigues that were far older than ours. His back was to me, his head tilted as though listening to something I could not hear. Slowly he turned, and dear God, his face, it was hollow, empty. Eyes darkened with void, mouth twisted in a soundless scream. His skin was cracked like old parchment, etched with the same twisted symbols we found in the forest. And yet, in that horrifying, mutilated visage, I saw recognition. He knew me. I woke gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The dream was not done with me. As I struggled to catch my breath, I heard movement outside my tent, slow, shuffling footsteps. With trembling hands, I reached for my rifle and crept outside, the freezing air biting through my uniform. The camp was eerily silent, cloaked in the swirling fog. The dying embers of our fire cast faint, flickering shadows that twisted and danced in unnatural patterns. I strained my ears, and then I heard it again, those same deliberate footsteps circling just beyond the light's edge. Who goes there? I shouted, my voice ragged and cracked. No answer. Just the slow, steady crunch of leaves underfoot. Then, I saw him. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the fog, was the same figure from my nightmare, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared. For what felt like an eternity, we stood frozen in that twisted tableau. Then, without warning, he raised one trembling, skeletal hand and pointed toward the forest, toward the chapel. My rifle slipped from my grasp as a sudden, unbearable cold enveloped me. The fog thickened, swallowing the figure whole until he was gone, if he had ever truly been there at all. I staggered back to my tent, shivering uncontrollably, unable to shake the feeling that something had marked me. I could still feel its gaze lingering even in the relative safety of the camp. The men know something is wrong. They look at me with wary, fearful eyes, as though they sensed the darkness that has latched onto my soul. They have every reason to be afraid. I fear whatever haunts these woods is coming for us all. Margaret, if these letters find you, know that I have tried to stay strong, to resist the pull of whatever malevolence festers in this accursed place. But its grip tightens with each passing night. I can feel it hollowing me out, piece by piece. I am so very sorry. Yours in whatever life comes after, Thomas. Daniel exhaled sharply, the words blurring before his eyes as an icy chill seeped into the room. He could almost hear the phantom footsteps pacing just outside the house, just beyond the windows obscured by frost. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the wind's distant howling. He rose shakily, half expecting to see some dark, twisted figure waiting just beyond the study's doorway, but the hall was empty, cloaked in shadows. Still, that sense of being watched lingered, crawling across his skin like the icy tendrils Thomas described in the letter. Daniel glanced at the remaining 2 envelopes, their stained edges calling to him like forgotten graves begging to be uncovered. He knew there was no turning back now. With trembling hands, he reached for the 4th letter. The old study seemed to breathe with its own malevolence, shadows stretching like clawed fingers across the faded walls. Daniel Grayson sat rigid in the worn leather chair, staring at the 4th envelope as if it might combust in his hands. The house around him groaned in protest, the wind outside shrieking like a soul denied passage from this world. The 3rd letter still lingered in his mind, visions of the twisted figure with hollow eyes, the cursed forest, and that dreadful chapel. He was no longer certain what frightened him more, the contents of the letters or the creeping sense that he was becoming part of the story they told. With no other choice, he broke the brittle seal of the 4th envelope, the paper crackling like dry leaves underfoot. The ink on the letter inside was smeared in places, as though written in desperation, or with trembling hands. Daniel began to read. Letter 4, June 30th, 1944. My dearest Margaret, I do not know what day it is anymore, or how long I have been trapped in this waking nightmare. Time slips through my fingers like sand, devoured by the endless nights and the cursed fog that never lifts. I have come to believe we are no longer in the world we once knew. We are lost, forgotten. The camp is gone. 3 nights ago, we awoke to find our entire encampment swallowed by the forest. Tents, supplies, even our makeshift fortifications, vanished without a trace. We wandered for hours, searching for familiar landmarks, but the forest twisted around us like a living thing, reshaping itself with malevolent intent. The men, what few remain, have grown restless, paranoid. They speak in hushed tones about the watchers, dark figures glimpsed just beyond the edges of the firelight. Their hollow eyes gleam like shards of broken mirrors, reflecting horrors best left unseen. I have seen them too. Last night we were ambushed, not by enemy soldiers but by something far worse. It began with that cursed whispering rising from the trees like a suffocating chant. We formed a defensive circle, rifles trained on the darkness, but the forest swallowed even the sound of our gunfire. Then came the screams. Private Langston was the first to fall, yanked into the blackness by unseen hands. His screams were short-lived, cut off with a wet, sickening crack. The others followed one by one, dragged into the shadows by figures that moved like smoke and shadow. Impossible to track, impossible to fight. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I fled through the twisted woods, heart pounding, branches clawing at my face in uniform. The forest seemed to laugh as it closed in around me, herding me like prey toward some inevitable doom. I found myself at the chapel once more. It loomed before me, dark and defiant, as if daring me to enter. The air was suffocating, thick with rot and a strange metallic tang like rusted iron. The ancient iron gate groaned as I pushed it open, its rust-streaked hinges shrieking like a damned soul. Inside, the twisted altar remained, soaked with blood both ancient and fresh. Symbols writhed across the walls like living things, shifting whenever I looked away. But it was what lay upon the altar that will haunt me until my dying breath. It was Private Langston, or what was left of him. His eyes were gone, his face twisted in an expression of unimaginable terror. Symbols had been carved deep into his flesh, still oozing dark, viscous fluid that defied explanation. Before I could move, a voice echoed through the chapel, a deep, guttural rasp that spoke in that same alien tongue I had heard before. It scraped against my mind, burning itself into my thoughts like a brand. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. Come, see, remember. The shadows coalesced into a figure, tall, robed in tattered remnants of a uniform long forgotten. His face was a twisted mockery of humanity, hollow and eyeless, his mouth stretched into a jagged, eternal grin. He raised one skeletal hand and beckoned me forward. I fled again, driven by sheer, primal terror. The forest seemed to close behind me, the chapel vanishing into the twisted trees as though it had never existed. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing into the cold, uncaring dirt. I do not know how long I lay there before waking to find myself alone once more, lost, abandoned, cursed. Margaret, I'm so very tired. This place is consuming me. I fear that even if I escape these cursed woods, I will never truly leave. I can feel its claws buried deep in my soul, dragging me back, always back. Pray for me. But above all, remember me. Do not let me be forgotten. Forever yours, in life or death. Thomas. Daniel finished reading, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in the study felt heavier now, charged with some unseen, malevolent presence. He could almost hear the forest's rustling branches and that cursed guttural chant rising from the depths of his memory. A sudden thump echoed from the darkened hallway beyond the study, making him jolt upright. His eyes darted toward the shadows gathered at the edge of the flickering candlelight. The sound came again, closer this time, slow, deliberate, as though something was making its way toward him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain seated despite the primal urge to flee. Whatever was coming, there was no running from it. He was trapped just like Thomas had been. With trembling fingers, Daniel reached for the final letter. The cold seemed to seep into Daniel's very bones, numbing his hands as he reached for the last envelope. His breath came in shallow gasps, clouding the air in front of him. The house groaned, its aged timbers shifting like restless spirits trapped within the walls. He could still hear the distant thump, thump, of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the darkened hallway. Whatever was out there was getting closer. Running was futile. He knew that now, just as Thomas must have known when he wrote the final letter. The envelope was heavier than the others, stained with something dark and dried long ago. The wax seal was broken as though someone, or something, had already read its contents. With grim resolve, Daniel unfolded the brittle parchment and began to read. Letter 5, July 4, 1944. Margaret, my beloved, this will be my last letter. I no longer know where I am, or who I am. The forest has taken everything from me, my comrades, my soul, my very sense of reality. The air here is thick with decay and whispers of forgotten names, mine among them. The chapel, it is not just a place. It is a doorway, a wound in the fabric of the world that should have remained closed. We were never meant to find it. We were led here, called by something ancient and starving, a thing that remembers every name it has ever claimed. I see their faces now, those who came before us. Soldiers from wars long forgotten, villagers from the cursed lands surrounding this place, all twisted into grotesque mockeries of what they once were. They are trapped here, bound by the same curse that now claims me. Last night I heard your voice. It called to me from the depths of the forest, soft and pleading, just as I remembered it. For one desperate, fleeting moment, I believed it was truly you, that you had somehow found me, reached across the impossible distance separating us. But it was a lie. I followed the voice through the choking fog, stumbling over roots and jagged rocks, my mind clouded by hope and madness. It led me back to the chapel, its cursed stones slick with fresh blood. The twisted altar waited, gleaming like a predator's grin in the dark. I was not alone. They were waiting, those hollow-eyed figures, their bodies twisted by centuries of torment. Among them I saw my comrades, Langston, Harris, even Beckett. Their faces were frozen in silent agony, their eyes hollow pits of darkness, just like the figure that had haunted my dreams. The robed figure emerged from the shadows, impossibly tall and wreathed in swirling mist. His mouth split into a jagged grin as he raised one skeletal hand toward me and spoke my name, Thomas Fisher. Come. The words scraped against my mind like broken glass. I fell to my knees, my strength drained by an unseen force. I could feel it digging into my memories, feeding on my fear, my despair, my very being. But even in that moment of utter hopelessness, I remembered you, Margaret. Your face, your voice, the life we were meant to have. I clung to that memory like a drowning man grasping for air. I do not know how I escaped or if I ever truly did. Perhaps I am still there, trapped in that cursed place, reliving this nightmare over and over again. But if by some miracle this letter reaches you, leave. Flee from this place. Burn this letter. Forget my name. Forget me. Do not let the shadows claim you as they have claimed so many before. And if you ever hear my voice calling from the dark, do not answer. Yours, forever beyond the veil, Thomas Fisher. Daniel's hands trembled as he lowered the letter, cold sweat beading on his forehead. The study felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as though the house itself had been listening, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed again, louder this time, coming from just outside the room. Slowly, the doorknob began to twist with an agonizing creak. Daniel rose unsteadily, backing away from the doorway. His breath hitched as the ancient door swung open, revealing only suffocating darkness beyond. A soft, familiar voice drifted from the shadows, warm, pleading, impossibly familiar. Daniel, is that you? His blood ran cold. He knew that voice, but he also knew the warning written in Thomas's final letter. If you ever hear my voice calling from the dark, do not answer. Daniel's knees buckled as a hollow-eyed figure emerged from the shadows, its twisted grin stretching far wider than should have been possible.